Forgive, but don't forget. You've probably heard this trite maxim splattered all over the place on social media or just anywhere. Like everybody knows that, right? It's a common saying, forgive, but don't forget. What if I were to tell you that it should be the exact opposite? Or at the very least, we'll put forgiveness aside for now. At the very least, there's a power in forgetting and that you should forget. That you could even argue that forgetting is forgiving. The two are intimately tied together. And well, no surprise, we're going to be using Nietzsche as a reference here. This is arguably Nietzsche's most powerful idea. I kind of say that as a sort of a double entendre, and this will make sense in a second with the worldview of will to power. But it's also something that is very unique to him, and I haven't heard from any other philosopher before. There's a lot of that with Nietzsche, but this one in particular, I think, is very, very unique to him. And he's a very ambiguous philosopher. I've heard people call him like oxymoronic. You can't really tell what he's actually trying to say, which I think isn't perfectly in line with his philosophy. That's for another video. But in one of his books, The Genealogy of Morals, which is usually the work that I suggest people read of his first if they want to directly tackle his actual texts, it's laid out pretty clearly. He doesn't use super fancy language. It's laid out almost like a story, which is really fun to read. But anyway, so let's talk about forgetfulness. Why is it powerful? Why is it forgiveness itself? Why is it more important than forgiveness? In order for you to best understand this, I think the best way to frame it would be to think of your memories. All right. So if we're being completely honest with ourselves, the things that we memorize the most are probably the most painful memories. Sure, we have great moments in our lives that we cherish and everything, but on a day-to-day basis, like if you're just not being harmed, if you're kind of just doing whatever, it's typically not going to be stored in your mind, right? It's almost like you kind of expect that the norm is for you to not be in danger, to not be in harm, that things are just okay, that you have good family, friends, whatever. That's the expectation that we all naturally have, especially if we're not feeling good, right? We expect that to be the norm. And so, really traumatic memories, bad memories, this is why people who experience trauma, they remember it so vividly and affects them the rest of their lives. It's like this ghost that never goes away. So if we're honest with ourselves, our most memorable memories, unfortunately, tend to be painful memories. And so the key, this is what Nietzsche sort of uses this as an insight to be like, okay, well, let's start off with that. Let's be honest with how we actually are. Let's observe our behaviors or thoughts. And so this is pretty true, right? I assume he has observed that about himself. I don't think he explains where he gets this from. But anyway, and then so based off of that, then he looked back into history, saying, okay, well, if why do we remember, right? Where does our not just our consciousness come from, but like our cognition? Like, why do we remember things in general? Like, what's the point? Because in Nietzsche's worldview, it's a naturalistic worldview where we're animals, right? And so other animals don't remember shit. They don't remember anything. Like my dog. Well, it's my brother's dog, not technically my dog, but my brother's dog. I'll feed her a piece of food, and then as soon as she eats the food, she's like, "Where can I have some food?" It's almost like she forgot. It's like the if you ever watch SpongeBob when Patrick is given the chocolate bar, and that's like the only food that they have to eat. And then he's like, I think I'll eat it now. And then he eats it, and then he's just like, I think I'll eat it now. And then he's like, I don't have a chocolate bar anymore. And he starts accusing SpongeBob of stealing his chocolate bar. He just didn't remember ever eating the chocolate bar. Right. So this is the natural state of things. Okay. You could say the less intelligent you are, the less human you are, especially compared to other animals, the more likely you are to forget. So at that point, then Nietzsche asked the question, why did humans start to remember? What was the point of that? If all other animals just forget and that's the norm, they just go off of instinct and don't remember anything, why would humans start to remember things? And So he breaks it down. I think it's in the second essay of Genealogy of Mortals. I kind of forget. I read it quite often, but I forget which parts which. Doesn't matter. But he takes a deep dive into, okay, what is needed in order for societies to run. And in a society, and Nietzsche's very naturally hierarchical. He believes in like inherently class structures. Like there's like going to be an upper class and a lower class. And so really what a society is the upper class kind of promising to protect the lower class within a societal structure, because otherwise, maybe a super strong ubermenchian man can exist out there in the wild by himself, but most people, common people, can't do that. They need to be in tribes, they need to be in communities. And so really what is going on there is that um the lower people need to have some sort of like promise that they're going to be protected. And so that is kind of like the origin of where memory comes from. You have to remember that this person at the top of the tribe, or these people, this elite class of these nobles, these warriors, are keeping you protected within a certain society. And you have to remember that. But it goes deeper than that, right? Because not only do you have to remember that, you have to remember what's going to happen to you if uh, what's going to happen to you if you do something against the people who are in charge, who are the people who are protecting you. So let's just say, for example, that you upset the people that created the society you're part of. Well, then you just get kicked out, right? You get kicked out, and then you're off in the wilderness by yourself, and you're probably going to die. All right. So, in order to avoid that pain, you need to start remembering. And so, Nietzsche categorizes this in a more modern context with a creditor and a debtor, a more modern context for us to understand. So, like creditors and debtors, all right, well, the whole idea of a creditor and debtor is that if you're a debtor, you need to remember that you owe something to the creditor. And the creditor needs benefits from making sure that the debtor, aka you, remembers that you owe them, right? And so sort of the origin of memory itself is kind of coming from this standpoint of avoiding pain. Because here's another thing too, is Nietzsche believes that the higher class, the nobles, they start with the valuation of I'm just good because I'm awesome and I'm powerful. Whether that's actually true or not is besides the point. He believes that to be true, and he starts that off as a basis of basically saying, well, I don't need other people to affirm who I am. I'm just awesome, and anybody who's not as good as me is therefore bad, or nobody who I can compete with or is as powerful as me. So automatically, if you're a powerful person at the top, you already have this ability to forget. You don't need to remember things, right? If you do have to remember things, it might be from the standpoint of making sure that the people that you're in charge of or you have power over remember the things that they owe you, maybe. But from Nietzsche's worldview, it seems like the debtor is the one that has memory first. And if we take a historical view or a historical outlook, and we just assume that societies start to, progress more and more over time, people start to become more and more sophisticated, then the people who are forced to remember and don't have the pleasure of forgetting or the leisure of forgetting, they have to remember because they have all these rules imposed upon them. They start to become smarter. They start to become more resentful too. Because the more things you have to remember, again, you have to remember because if you don't remember, something bad will happen to you, right? So just the fact that you have to memorize a bunch of stuff, let's say you have to memorize all these laws or else you get kicked out, or, somebody takes your wife or whatever, or chops your hand off, right? You might be tempted to do all these things, these natural urges that you have, but you're not going to do them. So let's say that I don't know, some military general, like his wife is like super hot and she's like a hoe, and she's been like looking at you like this, but you're just some commoner dude, you're like a blacksmith or something, or maybe even lower than that. You just work in the fields, but somehow, you're born with a good genetic structure. She finds you attractive, whatever, and then she tries to seduce you. Well, your animalistic impulse, your urges is going to say, "Oh, well, I want to reproduce with her too. That's going to feel good. That's going to be awesome. She's super hot." However, you remember, "Oh, this is the warlord's wife. If I do this, then and I get caught, uh, I'm going to die a horrific death. He's probably going to kill me and my entire family just in revenge, right?" So then you don't do that. That's the utility of memory. And this is the exact sort of thing that Nietzsche's getting at here. He's not necessarily saying that memory is bad, but in the genealogy of morals, one of the things he's trying to look at is, where do our valuations of good and bad, good and evil come from? And in terms of good and evil, meaning that the slave class or the lower class says that we're good and the powerful people are bad, a lot of that comes from the fact that we had to form memory in order to make sure that we don't upset the higher class, to for them to just stomp on us, right? And so that entire concept, or that entire way of thinking is automatically coming from, for lack of a better term, a beta way of thinking. All right, we're going to put it in manosphere terms. And so you're naturally reactive. All right, your entire morality and your entire view of the world is based off of you not being able to express power and doing what you want, your natural urges, the thing that the masters are able to do. And then instead, you have to make a cope. You have to create yourself as the hero of your own story. And then also, as you get smarter, as you develop more, as the mind develop more historically, or ancestrally, whatever you want to call it, they start to become more aware of, like, them being, I don't want to say cheated, but you're more aware. The more rules that are imposed on you, the more you're aware that you are not in power, and the more you start to resent those in power. All right. And that's where the whole idea of slave morality, ressentiment, which is resenting those who have power over you that prevents you from doing the thing that you want, comes from. And so if you have a really good memory in theory, and in Nietzschean thought, I should say, if you remember a lot of things, typically you're remembering not the greatest things, or at least that's the origin of where memory comes from. And so if we go back to the modern day, if we look at ourselves, again, Nietzsche doesn't talk about this, but this is my personal theory, is that he looked internally at himself, because he's a very introspective, very self-aware person, right? Or he was. So I think he looked at himself and said, well, all the things that I remember vividly are like bad things, right? So let's work backwards from here. That's why it's called a genealogy and not a historical account. Um, and this is why he was so ahead of his time, is modern psychology, modern psychological research shows this to be true. There's a very famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. You might have heard of it. But sort of the central thesis of that book, or one of the main ideas, is that human beings are way more motivated by avoiding pain than they are seeking pleasure. Well, if we're way more motivated by avoiding pain, then what does that imply? If we're more motivated by avoiding pain, that's the thing that we're going to pay attention to. If that's the thing we're going to pay attention to is pain and avoidance of it, we're going to have more memories of that. And so it makes sense, all the aforementioned reasons, that is the origin of memory and us being able to remember. All right. And so back to the point of the video, why you should forget and not forgive. Well, if we acknowledge that when you form memories, usually they're in the form of something painful. Typically, what that means is that by remembering things that happen to you, bad things that happen to you, which is implied in the maxim "forgive but don't forget," that you remember all of the bad things that happen to you, then that inherently, based off of a Nietzschean worldview, that inherently will still have power over you. That will naturally have power over you the same way that the masters had power over the slaves. And then, so let's just say that a woman cheated on you, or a woman screws you over, or somebody screws you over at work or whatever, right? If you forgive but don't forget, that ghost, that apparition, or whatever you want to call it, that spirit, the past spirit is always going to haunt you unless you forget and let it go. And it's a very difficult thing to do. You can't just willingly forget. You have to really start to live a life that you're really proud of, and you actually have to truly have pride in yourself. Pride is very important in a Nietzschean worldview, and I fully believe that myself too. But we live in a world now where it's cringe if you're pride. It's if you have pride, it's cringe if you think that you're great. And you should lower yourself down and do self-deprecating humor and always, just be humble and whatever, right? like like we're taught from a young age that standing out is bad. And especially me being Japanese, half Japanese, I was especially taught that standing out is bad. All right. So, in order for you to really not have people control you in your life, and a lot of guys, especially, they have women control their lives. Let's be honest. Um, Whether it be immediate women in their lives, or they're already in a relationship, or they want women really badly romantically, those women that they desire then have power over them. And then they have even more power over them, especially if they had some bad experiences around it. That's the entire manosphere, man. Is a lot of these guys not being able to forget what happened there. Because if you have a bunch of stuff going on in your life that you're really proud of and you're really pursuing, it's way easier to forget, like when women screwed you over. Dude, I had so many women screw me over in my lifetime, and men usually in the form of business. If you're familiar with my content on my original channel, probably know what I'm talking about. Um, and then with women too, I actually told some stories on my main channel as well, of sort of being betrayed or whatever. And especially these past few years, where I've really delved into philosophy, studied Nietzsche, have been living life meaningfully, traveling around the world. I forget. I don't even remember that stuff. Like, I have to consciously. They don't pop up out of nowhere where I'm just like, oh yeah, I remember that one girl, Alex, which is actually her name, by the way. It's a small channel. I don't care. Like, she screwed me over that one time, back on that island in Vietnam. You know, um, I don't even remember that stuff. I just don't. And if I do, typically it's because there's something that's not going well in my life. I'll be in this very negative mindset, so I'll start to remember all these bad things. You know what I mean? And so the power to forget is very, very powerful. Yeah. And that's why I think, again, double entendre, I think it's his most powerful idea because it is based off of power itself. Also, just the efficacy of that idea itself. And so it's just something to think about, man. It's something to think of. Forgetting is something to think about. But memory is necessary for you to be resentful. Forgetting, everything is about values to Nietzsche, everything. So when you forget about something, that means you don't really value it and you don't care, right? So if you forget about the women who fucked you over, if you forget about the people in general who screwed you over, then that just means that they don't have power over you because you don't care, because you don't value that. You value other things. That's why at the end of the day, everything is about creating your own values, creating your own life in a Nietzschean worldview. So, yeah, this is kind of a tough video to make because it gets pretty abstract, and I was trying to put into words what Nietzsche already said, but he said it much better than me. So, uh, but maybe I put it in a more modern context to make it a little bit more understandable. But like I said, Genealogy of Mortals is his most readable work, where you don't need any philosophical background or whatever before. You could read it and probably understand it. So, if you haven't read it already, highly suggest. If I had one of those Amazon links, I would share it. But maybe for the future. But anyway, just for now, maybe I'll create one for this video. Actually, I'll try it, and I highly suggest getting that book and giving it a read if you haven't already. If you're really interested in Nietzsche, and especially this types of stuff that I have to say, and you really resonate with the things I say, 90 something percent of my worldview comes from a Nietzschean framework. Not all of it. I definitely have my disagreements with him, but my disagreements are pretty minor. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comment section. This is a fun video to make. I'll see you tomorrow.